Welcome to The Forum, your modern-day coffee house, where ideas can be birthed, exchanged, and wrestled with. We celebrate questions, conversation, and reason as powerful tools to enlighten hearts and transform minds, shaping a new generation of thinkers, innovators, and pioneers. We're glad you're here, so pull up a chair and let's begin.
So this morning I'm going to talk about the subject of morality. And that. So if my brother was here, he would say, and he sounds a bit like this,
"Tell you what, this country has gone to the dogs, and I would have left it if I had somewhere to go."
So we have this idea that our moral standards are slipping. And here's some headlines. The Daily Mail, this is from 2007. 4 in 5 people believe Britain is in moral decline. That picture went with that headline. 2010, Daily Express headline, UK sinks into moral decline. 2012, The Independent, if you thought they were a bit right-wing, Bishop says moral decline has hit epidemic levels. 19th of March 2025, The Scotsman, a luxurious moral decadence has consumed and weakened the British state. However, a study in Nature, which is a very prestigious scientific journal, found that basically our perceptions of moral decline have been going on as long as the question has been asked. They did a study of people's perceptions in 60 countries, and across all of them, there was a perception of moral decline. And yet, as they looked at the hard evidence on crime and other things, but as they also talked to people about their day-to-day personal experience, that data suggested that things were actually the same, or maybe even a bit better. So what they said is the gap between our perception and the seeming reality of morality in our society is 2 things. It's firstly what they call the biased exposure effect, which means that we are programmed to look for negative things. Maybe it's part of our survival instinct, but we look for negative things. And of course, we're helped enormously by our friends in the media. And then the second thing is called biased memory effect, which means that we look back with rose-tinted spectacles. We tend to erase the bad memories as we look backwards, so it always seems like it was better. And of course we know it was, don't we? So if there's nothing wrong, if people's behavior is not really declining, why bother looking at morality? Well, I think something is changing, and I'll come on to talk about what I think that is, and you can make your own mind up. In philosophy, there's 3 main branches of ethics. The first is, it's called normative ethics, and it's the main theories. There's 3 of them, and they've been around for a long time. And then there's something called meta-ethics, which is all the big questions about, is there objective good or not, these sorts of things. And then the third one is applied ethics, when we try and actually apply it to something real. I'm going to start with the classic 1967 Trolley Problem. So this is a classic of ethics. And basically, this train is coming down the track, its brakes have failed, and it can either carry on and it's going to take out those 5 people, or, that's you in the middle, you can pull the lever and divert it, and it's just going to take out 1. I did see quite an amusing video, which I almost showed you, and it was of a small child with this actually set up as like a play set, and what the small child did, and it was terrifying for the parents, I'm sure, is it took the 1 and put it next to the 5, and then just ran the train over all 6 of them. I think we've got our next Prime Minister right there. So, this is deceptively simple, but maybe in practice it's not quite as simple as it seems. Maybe it's not as easy in practice as it seems to be in theory, and I'll come back to the trolley problem. But let me talk about the 3, this is the normative bit, the 3 main theories of ethics. And they've been around for a long time. The very newest of them is 200 years old, and the oldest is 2,000 years old. So, let me start with utilitarianism. It's sometimes called consequentialism, and that's because it's all about consequences. It's all about what happens. So this is, utilitarianism is the simplest form of consequentialism, and that's the one I'm going to talk about. It was proposed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill about 200 years ago, and it's only focused on outcomes. And so the morality of any action depends entirely on its results. And the core principle is that the right action is the one that produces the best overall result. The other way of saying that is it maximizes utility, which is where utilitarianism comes from. And in this approach, everyone's equal, and no action is inherently right or wrong. It's purely dependent on the results. Now, this approach lends itself to statistics. It can be made quite practical. And in the trolley problem, the answer's really simple. You just take out the 1 person because that maximizes the outcome as a whole, and you save 5. Very simple. So that would appear to be an easy solution. But there are some problems with it. Utilitarianism can justify seemingly unjustifiable things, such as punishing an innocent person in order to achieve some kind of broader social peace. Utilitarianism says that's okay because you got a good outcome, but I think most of us think there's something wrong with that. And although it's seemingly inclusive because everyone is counted the same, actually small groups, by definition, carry less weight because you're trying to get the biggest outcome for the majority. So it's not quite as inclusive as it seems. It also assumes that people go around trying to maximize utility all the time. And that would have meant anyone who had a cup of coffee or a croissant, you should have donated that money to charity where it could have maximized utility. And so, firstly, you should feel a bit guilty. And secondly, I think it shows that people do not behave that way. It's not sustainable or realistic. We're also really, really bad at measuring the long-term effect of things, history tells us. We're also very bad at measuring happiness, And we're also very bad at measuring suffering. Apart from that, we're really good at measuring. So there are some problems with this that are actually quite serious, and I'm going to go on to talk about a real example at the end that shows just how terrifying it can be. So what are the alternatives? Well, the second one is rules or duty-based ethics. It's sometimes called deontological ethics, and it's associated with our friend Immanuel Kant. I call him our friend because, of course, he's the principal philosopher of the Enlightenment, which, of course, is what the Forum is based on. That's about 250 years ago, although there's a branch of this called divine command theory, which is at least 4,000 years old and is associated with religious scriptures. So in this approach, morality is grounded in rules, duties, and obligations, not outcomes. And that means that some actions are intrinsically morally right or wrong. And that's completely independent of what happens. Kant argued that we should always act according to rules that could apply to everyone. He called this the categorical imperative, which doesn't matter, but the essence of it is if you say, I think I can justify this lie, Kant would say, go ahead, as long as you're happy for everyone to justify their lie too. So the test is, if you're doing something, are you happy for it to be a universal law that applies to everyone or not? Now, the good thing about this, compared to utilitarianism, is that it treats people as ends in themselves, never as a means to an end. But there are some problems. It's seen as very rigid and inflexible. So what about the people who hid Jews from the Nazis and lied about it? If there's a universal law that says you can't lie, and now you've got a clash, you've got saving a life versus telling a lie, this approach has no reliable way to work out that trade-off. It's also criticized for being too abstract and theoretical because, as we know, real life is quite messy. My boss, whose job I now share with somebody else, used to always say, what is our preferred problem? And I never understood quite why he said it so often until I got into his job, because basically every single decision you make leaves you with a problem, and the trick is having the one you want. So real life's just not as clean and tidy as this form of ethics suggests. And in the trolley problem, what about the rule? I mean, one of the kind of almost universal rules of all societies, do not kill. Well, in the trolley problem, someone is going to die, and therefore it's immediately not optimal, and immediately your decision is leading to someone dying. So what do you do about that? You can't keep that universal law. You're making another kind of decision, and it doesn't really help you very much with how to do it. I'll come back to those problems later too. And then finally, virtue ethics. This is associated with Aristotle, and it's therefore 2,000 years old, which is quite old. Lindsay and I were in Seattle once, and there was a tour guide who was clearly an actor who was trying to make a living. But he was a physically larger than life character, but it was a big personality, and he was saying, hey, you Europeans, I'm going to show you some things today that are more than 100 years old. So, anyway, this is 2,000 years old, which is genuinely quite old. And this doesn't focus on what to do, it focuses on who to be. It's about developing good moral character. And so, this is about classic virtues like courage, kindness, these sorts of things. And Aristotle said that the purpose of humans is to live well in the context of those things, and what you get at the end of it is human flourishing. Now, this approach requires a context-sensitive approach, and therefore it actually needs practical wisdom, which in turn requires emotional and social intelligence. And so you have to apply your goodness into some kind of context. A modern version of this is the bracelets that say, "What would Jesus do?" Or, in our house, "What would Elvis do?" So, you're trying to emulate good examples of people of moral character. And in the trolley example, it's not much use to you in the moment. But possibly, you could have been the person who helped to make sure that the trolley's brakes were regularly serviced and checked in the first place to avoid the problem upstream. But there are some criticisms. That's a surprise to you, isn't it? There are some issues. It doesn't always tell you what to do, as I've just said. Sometimes the perception of virtue can vary between cultures. So something we value in one culture is not valued in another. And just like rules can conflict, virtues can conflict. What about honesty and kindness? Yes, you look genuinely horrible in that outfit. That's the honesty virtue, but maybe not so hot on the kindness virtue. But you look absolutely great. Why don't you go out in that? Is potentially a problem as well. What do you do? And in this kind of postmodern era, we like our heroes to be flawed and ironic. We don't like the idea of good people that we look up to. It's not really in our culture, and so this has actually been very out of fashion. And after the Enlightenment exchanged a sense of human purpose for a sense of human autonomy. And now we're not sure what we're really here for in the post-Enlightenment world. And having a sense of that is important to virtue ethics because it tells you why you're here and helps you understand what to value. And actually, nowadays, we find that hard. So, these issues have been around for a long time, but now you're going to fix them. This is just a little summary of the different types, strengths, weaknesses, characteristics, and you've got maybe 6 or 7 minutes on your tables just to have a discussion on which of these do you like the best or dislike the most? What do you think about them? Just have a general discussion about these and whether you resonated with them or quite the opposite. 6 or 7 minutes. Go ahead. So in this section, I want to talk about what do we base our ethical decisions on? What's the source of authority for the decisions we make? and what happens if we get it wrong and then have a few regrets about it. So this is all about who tells us what ought is. So, once again, there's quite a bit to choose between. So let's begin with religion. There we go. Let's start with religion. Of course, traditionally, religion was the primary source of ethical norms in society. Hans Kung was a Swiss Catholic theologian. He was quite controversial to the point that he was banned from teaching in the Catholic Church. But nonetheless, he was an advocate for a universal ethical foundation derived from the moral teachings of the world religions. And his idea was formalized in the 1993 Parliament of the World's Religions Declaration Towards a Global Ethic. And he used some bits of the Ten Commandments and he sort of broadened them out. And so he said, "You shall not kill" is a principle of non-violence and reverence for life. "You shall not steal" broadens out into justice and economic fairness. "You shall not lie" is about truthfulness and integrity. And "you shall not commit sexual immorality" is about mutual respect and dignity. He believed human conscience was shaped by religion, but he also believed that people of no faith could also be covered by an ethic like this. He was pretty anti-dogma, just FYI. So he's not the classic sort of fundamentalist theologian. This is my thought, not his, but I do wonder whether some of the scriptures of various religions, they're almost like the original large language models of reality and morality, an experience of God. But there's all sorts of stories in there that illustrate different moral situations and outcomes, and some of them are pretty raw. And so there's something interesting in there. But here's the issue. The authority of religion is in decline in the West. And, that's been accelerated by some of the moral challenges in the church, for example. Also, religious morality is continuously reinterpreted in culture, and therefore it's not a truly universal fixed point, because we come to different conclusions based on its principles at different times. And some people think that religious morality is actually immoral on topics like slavery, human sexuality, gender equality, and so on. So that's certainly not the answer for everyone, but it's been the answer for society for a long time, particularly in the West. So what about morality based on reason? And the Enlightenment was deliberately trying to break the hold of the church and to replace religious authority with the authority of reason. And our friend Immanuel Kant was at the forefront of this, and he, as we've already said, was the author of rules-based, rational, universal moral principles. And so that was Kant's answer to the question as to what we should base our morality on, and he was directly challenging the authority of religious morality. But, and this point is best made by Alistair MacIntyre, Kant's view of rationality is potentially flawed. It's too abstract, it's too detached from a social context, it's too reliant on shared assumptions that no longer exist, and it's actually unable to tell us what to value. MacIntyre actually argues that the only reason that Kant's approach worked was that Kant was unconsciously still using theism, basically his religious context, a tradition to deal with those problems. Because as I think I've said before, Kant was no atheist. He believed in God. And MacIntyre says if you strip all the God assumptions out of Kant, the whole thing collapses, and it's not a good basis for morality at all, because you need a sense of tradition to give you a sense of purpose, and it's only that sense of purpose that allows you to prioritize the different rules. And without that, it doesn't work. So maybe, says Richard Rorty, we don't need any objective standards, universal objective knowledge at all. Maybe morality should be based on human experience, culture, and social interaction. Maybe we develop a sense of right and wrong in our context, and each society draws its own conclusions. He proposed the idea of solidarity as an alternative to reason or religious authority, and basically said what we should do is expand our circle of concern to include as many people as possible. And he said that actually literature and storytelling is good for that because it gives us empathy with other people in other contexts. But critics of this approach say it's basically moral relativism, and that makes it hard to choose between different competing moral claims because there's nothing to refer to. They argue it's vague, indecisive, and passive, and it's actually this kind of human sympathy idea is insufficient to stand up to oppression and cruelty because it's just not sufficiently tangible in practice. So where do we go next? If there's issues with religious authority, if there's questions about whether reason can really work in practice, if we're not sure that just society coming up with its own ideas is a very stable foundation, what about the natural world? So Drew Dalton, who's an American philosopher, in his book, The Matter of Evil, suggests an ethical framework based on naturalism, based on the universe, more specifically, based on the principle of entropy. Entropy, he defines as a tendency towards disorder and decay. And he suggests that this isn't just a physical thing, it's a metaphysical thing. It's about our experience as humans. And he introduces the idea of unbecoming. So many of you will have heard the term becoming, this idea that we're sort of evolving into something, into better versions of ourselves as we grow and develop. Dalton says actually that's all the wrong way round. We're actually unbecoming. We are decaying and becoming less because that's how the universe works. And he suggests that actually ethical positivity is just a misconception because that's not the reality of the world we live in. However, he says that this shouldn't lead us to despair, just in case that's where you were going, but rather it gives us a realistic and compassionate approach to ethical responsibility. For him, ethics is focused on alleviating unnecessary suffering and resisting the natural drift towards disorder. He calls it an ethics of resistance. And he believes that that should include challenging oppressive systems, environmental degradation, and social injustice. So, a bit like the recent talk here, he makes something meaningful and hopeful from a situation that you could argue is quite nihilistic. But just for fun, he's not quite at the end of that spectrum. And so let me introduce Julio Cabrero, who is an Argentinian philosopher. He takes this a stage further. He says all of us are in a situation of moral impossibility. It's completely impossible for us not to do harm to ourselves and others. He believes human life is actually negative, not positive, because we're born into a condition we didn't choose. We're compelled to live, make decisions, and act in ways that cause harm. And along the way, we experience suffering, frustration, dependency, and eventually death. I've heard he's quite a lot of fun at parties, by the way. He proposes what he calls a form of moral abstention, which includes a commitment to not have children. He believes that bringing children into the world brings that cycle of harm again to someone else. Somehow or other, he rejects nihilism. I don't know how. And he basically says that our ethical action should be to minimize harm. Now, there are one or two criticisms of this point of view, which this time I think you might be relieved to hear. Critics say that this has an overemphasis on suffering, and it completely ignores our experiences of joy, beauty, and love. It says that it's extreme to the point of absurdity, and if we were to take, in particular, Cabrero literally, that would be the end of humanity, because no one would have children. And they say that although they seem to find some kind of reason to take action, quite honestly, this is nihilism, and it's a completely meaningless world that they have depicted, which is not how most people encounter the world. And unfortunately, that's my last option. So the kind of killer option which you were waiting for that solved everything, I haven't got it, but you're going to pick one or two. Oh. There's a table which kind of summarizes those things which we haven't got. So let me tell you about them again. There's religious-based morality, there's reason-based morality, there's social-based reality, and then there's kind of materialistic universe-based morality, and then it's extreme offshoot, negative ethics. So those are the things. Spend just 5 minutes having a discussion as to which of these options you've fallen in love with and are now going to use as the definitive basis for the rest of your life. So what I'm going to try and do now, that's the only free, angry-looking robot I could find, and I wasn't going to pay £10. I'm going to try and apply some of what we've talked about to AI, partly because I know something about it, and partly because no one has figured this out. And so we're all in the same boat. And of course, what I'm going to say is not exhaustive and short. But nonetheless, hopefully, it'll give you a sense of some of the ways that these ideas are being applied to a brand new subject. So firstly, utilitarianism. How is that being applied to AI? Well, the most obvious approach, and I would say a broadly positive approach, is that the industry is trying to reduce the most negative impacts from harmful content, bias, and hallucinations. It's trying to do that with the best positive impact for the most people. So it's starting with the worst things and addressing them first. That actually involves human feedback. That's how it's done, something called reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF. So before it goes live, people use it, and when they find that it tells them how to build an explosive device or these sorts of things, they make changes before it gets into the hands of everybody else. So that's utilitarianism, I would say, being used in quite a positive way in AI. But here's a darker use of utilitarianism in the AI space. Amongst the most extreme of the futurists, they believe that some kind of eternal digital future where trillions of human consciousnesses will be uploaded and will have everything that they want, they think that that's so compelling that it justifies absolutely anything we might need to do in the here and now to achieve it, including the elimination of millions of people if necessary. And that shows all the weaknesses of utilitarianism, because most of us know, intuitively I would suggest, that there's something wrong with that picture. Apart from the fact that it's science fiction, surely there's intrinsic value to all those people who are potentially being sacrificed for the good. So what about rule-based ethics? How has that been used? Well, there's a multitude of regulations, laws, and ethics codes emerging. You might be exposed to some of these things at work or elsewhere. And there was a study in 2023 that compared 200 ethics codes and found that there were 17 common themes, but the fact that they managed to find 200 tells its own story. And interestingly, to me at least, and we'll find out whether it's interesting to you in just a moment, these codes reflect some of the sources of moral authority which we discussed previously. So there's a religious one. My example is the Rome Call for AI Ethics, which was produced by the Catholic Church. And you might say, well, thanks for that, Catholic Church. I'm sure no one is taking much notice of it. But actually, some of the organizations that have signed up to that include Cisco, IBM, and Microsoft. It's actually really good. What about Enlightenment humanism? Well, UNESCO, the UN body, has produced an AI governance framework based on a human-centric view of the world. That's the Enlightenment view of the world. Social values? Well, the ISO AI principles document actually takes as its starting point societal views as a way of guiding the use of AI. And then finally, environmental and non-harm. Friends of the Earth have produced their own AI principles. And so we see that there's sort of everything is new and nothing is new. All these codes, all these rule-based moral systems have emerged, and they've emerged representing all the pick and mix options we discussed as the sources of moral authority. However, in his paper, which I find to be quite amusing, called The Uselessness of AI Ethics, Luke Munn says this, amongst many other things: a flood of AI guidelines and codes of ethics has been released in both the public and private sector in the last several years. However, these are meaningless principles which are contested or incoherent, making them difficult to apply. This is the same problem as the trolley problem. So you have a code, but what do you do in the messy world of real life? It's just another example of the same old, same old. So let me say, laws, regulations, and codes, I think, are useful and necessary, but they're a long way off being the whole solution. So what about virtue ethics? Well, philosopher Shannon Valor proposes 12 techno-normal virtues. That's not a form of dance music, but she proposes that if humans imagine, develop, and use technology according to these virtues, the world would be a better place. And they are honesty, self-control, humility, justice, courage, empathy, care, civility, flexibility, perspective, magnanimity, I got there, and something that she calls techno-moral wisdom. She actually does an application to social media, and she emphasizes there empathy, humility, honesty, and perspective. And if we were imagining, developing, and using social media with those things in mind, her suggestion is that some of the harms that have emerged from social media will be mitigated. I think it's also important just to note, if we look at the world, the gap between those virtues and the sorts of things we see in parts of the tech world from which all this stuff is coming. It doesn't look quite as virtuous as she is suggesting it should. But what about the technology itself? Can we think of it as virtuous? Well, philosophers Nigel Shadbolt and Roger Hampson take a big step in that direction. They've written a book called As If Human. And what they say is the best way of looking ethically at AI is to imagine that it's human and to judge it as if it was. They are well aware that it's not, and that there's some virtues which they say can't be operative. So you can't have a courageous AI, but you can have an honest one, and you can have one with a degree of self-control, and you can have some kind of justice embedded in it. So maybe it's possible to think of AI through the lens of virtues, and maybe that's useful. But could a machine learn to be virtuous? Well, two researchers, Marcus Berberick and Klaus Diepold, actually are suggesting AI could be trained on patterns of behavior from good people, stories and information about them. And this is right back to what would Jesus do sort of thinking, but their idea is, could you train AI to know what good looks like, literally, and to start applying that to itself so that not everything has to be programmed by a human. It's quite an interesting idea, but I have to say, at this point, it's still a theoretical proposal. No one's tried to do it. So let me draw it to a close. I think there's some things we can, and of course you will take from it whatever you wish. What I took from it is that maybe our moral behavior isn't deteriorating, and that's a good thing. But our approaches to ethics have become complex and fragmented, and we're looking to different things to draw our sense of right and wrong from, and that's creating some complexity in our society. Religion used to provide a common ethical framework for many societies, but it was challenged by the Enlightenment. And then the Enlightenment was challenged by lots of movements, starting with Romanticism and going on through postmodernism, saying, well, actually, there is no universal reason. And so there's a suggestion we base it on societal views. And then we've got people saying, but that's entirely subjective and completely unconvincing. Why don't we base it on the natural world? And then we have people saying the whole thing's a waste of time because there is no positive ethics in existence. So what should we do in light of all of this? I've got 3 suggestions. Number 1, I think it's maybe a good thing to recognize that morality is not straightforward, and that should make us respectful of other people who get to a conclusion via a different route to us. Secondly, maybe we should take the advice of the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who basically said, pick a moral system that best aligns with your personal views and context and live by it. It's better to live by something that you pick than to not live by anything at all, he says. And then finally, I think this is a subject we could all learn a lot more about by talking to each other, and that's a little bit what we've been doing today, and things like the forum are a great way of expanding our minds and our perspectives on these things, and I hope in some very small way that's happened this morning. But that's all I had to say, except, in the meantime, be good. Thank you.